There's something back there, and we're going to find it. We're going to find out what it is.
Hello, Zer0 Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. As we come to the end of 2019, I'm going to forego the requisite look back on the last 2 decades and avoid writing a list of the best pop songs and movies. Instead, I'll look at an essay the philosopher Slavoj Zizek wrote for The Independent under the headline, quote, "There is no conflict between the struggle against antisemitism and the struggle against Israeli occupation." As seems to be the norm these days, Zizek's essay inspired a backlash and a myriad of condemnations. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz ran a response entitled, "The UK's Independent publishes op-ed by Slavoj Zizek calling settlements, quote, the trouble with Jews," end quote. Despite Zizek's long-standing opposition to anti-Semitism in all its forms, his essay on the Israeli settlements was condemned as, quote, "a clear example of anti-Semitism," end quote. The only example of Zizek's anti-Semitism given is in the Haaretz headline. But when looked at in context, Zizek's line about the trouble with Jews today is itself a condemnation of anti-Semitism. Here's the entire sentence as it was originally written. "The trouble with Jews today is that they are now trying to put down roots in a place which was for thousands of years inhabited by other people." When taken in context, it's plain to see that this is not an anti-Semitic sentence, but is rather a condemnation of the philosopher Alain Finkielkraut's statement in Le Monde, a statement that Zizek described as a, quote, "weird attempt to mobilize anti-Semitic cliches in order to legitimize Zionism." While justifying the settlements, Alain Finkielkraut claimed that the Jews have chosen to put down roots. According to Zizek, Finkielkraut was suggesting that while Jews may have been rootless cosmopolitans undermining traditional life in the past, the Israeli settlements are correcting this fault in the Jewish character. Zizek objects to this line of reasoning both because it reinforces anti-Semitic myths and because it justifies a criminal occupation. Anyone who actually read the essay that Haaretz, the Times of Israel, the Jewish Telegraph Agency, and the Jewish News all reported as an example of Zizek's anti-Semitism would understand that Zizek's point was that the most virulent forms of anti-Semitism today are launched in defense of the Israeli occupation. It's easy to see that Slavoj Zizek is not an anti-Semite. Like most of the allegations and condemnations aimed at the Slovenian philosopher, these charges are made in defense not of Jewish people, but of the power structures that shape our modern politics. However, even as we defend Zizek from baseless and calculated outrage, we should also consider why allegations of anti-Semitism, when leveled at leftists, tend to stick. We should ask ourselves, does the far left have an anti-Semitism problem? The late Marxist philosopher Moishe Postone would answer in the affirmative.
Particularity is constitutive. Modern anti-Semitism is frequently misunderstood as a form of racism. Whereas most forms of racism attribute concrete physical and sexual power to another that is considered inferior, however, modern anti-Semitism does not treat the Jews as inferior, but as powerful purveyors of evil. Moreover, the power attributed to the Jews is never concrete and physical, but abstract, intangible, and global. The Jews within this framework constitute an immensely powerful, invisible, international conspiracy that seeks to control the world. I've argued elsewhere that modern anti-Semitism reifies the abstract, dynamic global domination of capital, which subjects people to the compulsion of abstract historical forces they cannot grasp directly as the domination of international Jewry. It provides a framework for understanding the complex and historically dynamic world of modern capitalism in concretistic terms and seeks to overcome processes of ongoing change that seem to be beyond the control of people. Within this Manichaean worldview, the struggle against the Jews is a struggle for human emancipation. Because anti-Semitism is distinguished by its populist, anti-hegemonic, and anti-global character, it can appear to be emancipatory. It blurs the differences between reactionary and progressive social critiques of capitalist modernity. Anti-Semitism fuses the deeply reactionary with the apparently emancipatory in an explosive amalgam. I'm suggesting then that modern anti-Semitism and the historical dynamic of capital are related.
Anti-Semitism can become mixed up in a sort of socialist vision, one best characterized as the socialism of fools. What's worth considering is the difference in approach that Postone and Zizek take towards this foolish socialism. For Postone, anti-Semitism is historical. While hating Jews has a long history, and the ideology of anti-Semitism can be traced back to medieval Europe, Postone claimed that the form, function, and character of modern anti-Semitism is entirely different than the anti-Semitic ideologies of the 17th century. For Postone, in modern times, the figure of the Jew is used to concretize and explain real social contradictions that arise not from any given ethnic minority or majority, but from the operations of a capitalist economy and capitalist ideology. For Zizek, the structures of anti-Semitism, the way we take up symbolic scapegoats to stand in for problems and traumas that cannot be understood directly, is transhistorical.
There's something back there, and we're going to find it. We're going to find out what it is.
For Zizek and Postone both, the figure of the Jew is similar to the witch in the 1999 film The Blair Witch Project. This film is probably the definitive found footage horror movie. With a budget of around $60,000, the movie did not rely on special effects or even on well choreographed and worked out scenes, but was instead shot by the actors themselves. The performances were improvised, and whatever suspense is in the movie was built up over days as the directors left strangely configured bundles of sticks, made scary noises, and planted animal carcasses for the actors to find. What was scary in the Blair Witch Project never appeared on the screen, but was always just out of view, hiding behind this or that cluster of pine trees, or shunted away beyond the next ridge. The monsters were always heard, but never seen.
One of the definitions of what Jacques Lacan calls real, le réel, is the point of impossibility within a field of reality. Along the same lines, what for Alain Badiou defines a world, and I think this is crucial when you read him, is not primarily the positive qualities, features of a world, but the way its structure, the structure of a world, relates to its inherent point of impossibility. Sometimes the whole world changes, not because there are some new positive qualities, but because the way this world relates to an impossibility changes. Maybe the same holds for capitalism. The capitalist dynamic of perpetual self-revolutionizing relies on the endless postponing of its point of impossibility, the final crisis, the collapse. I mean, the best formula for this is when John Maynard Keynes was asked, but what about, will your politics work in the long term? He says, in the long term, we are all dead. And the whole point is to postpone it. What is for other earlier modes of production a dangerous exception is for capitalism normality. Crisis is in capitalism internalized, taken into account as the point of impossibility which pushes the system to continuous activity. Capitalism is structurally always in a crisis. This is why it is expanding all the time. It can only reproduce itself by way of borrowing from the future. So you see the parallel I'm making. It's still an impossibility, but it's made internal to the system, which changes the entire dynamics. And perhaps, that's my global philosophical hypothesis, one should extend this to the very definition of humanity. Maybe what ultimately distinguishes man from other animals are not some primarily, at the most radical level, some positive features, speech, tool-making, reflexive thinking, whatever, but the rise of a new point of impossibility, designated by Freud and Lacan as the impossible, real, ultimate point of reference of desire, and so on, and so on.
For Postone, the formal structure of anti-Semitism arises out of the central ideological apparatus within the capitalist mode of production. And while Zizek and Postone would agree that the fact that it is specifically Jews who have come to be the symbol covering up the traumatic core of capitalism is entirely contingent or arbitrary, what is not clear is the degree to which Postone and Zizek would disagree about the transhistorical necessity for something like formal anti-Semitism. That is, for Zizek, human beings can never be fully transparent to themselves, and the social field or society must always appear as something relatively mystified or opaque. Postone proposes that the aim of critical theory is to provide an eminent critique of society while taking one's own standpoint within society into account. That is, the aim is to be able to find a position within capitalist society wherein one can critique the basis for one's own self-conception. This is possible precisely because capitalism has, as Zizek mentioned in the preceding clip, taken the impossibility of its own justification into itself, or to put it in economic terms, because the capitalist system is riven with contradictions that lead to crises of various sorts. For Postone, the dialectical nature of social reality, the way in which our self-conception arises out of a contradiction or impossibility, which we then reify or symbolize in various ways, is a product of capitalism and is not transhistorical. However, our ability to do critical theory, to find a standpoint from which to critique society, is also historical. It is also a product of capitalism. In his book, Capitalist Realism, the late Mark Fisher described this paradox this way. One of the virtues of capitalist realism is the alienation it provides. Capitalist realism presents itself as a shield, protecting us from the perils posed by belief itself. The attitude of ironic distance proper to postmodern capitalism is supposed to immunize us against the seductions of fanaticism. Lowering our expectations, we're told, is a small price to pay for being protected from terror and totalitarianism. Capitalist realism here is analogous to the deflationary perspective of a depressive who believes that any positive state, any hope, is a dangerous illusion. Now, what Mark Fisher is saying about postmodern capitalism, perhaps Zizek would say about capitalism itself, and Postone might be forced to say something similar as well. That is, it is capitalism and the ideologies that come along with it that have fractured us off from society, that have created critical individuals. And if we are hoping to get beyond capitalism, we can only do so by holding on to our critical position. This presents a problem. To sum up, the claim that Slavoj Zizek is an anti-Semite is entirely unfounded. What he is, I think, is a symptom or symbol for the impossibility that the left, and in particular the Marxist left, has yet to either overcome or sublate. Namely, that we rely on capitalist relations and its attendant crises to provide the alienated freedom that we need in order to carry on our project of liberation. Worse, we don't quite know whether our ultimate goal is to bring this paradox to full consciousness, to create a society that can work with and even consciously create its own traumatic impossibilities collectively and freely, or if we are aiming instead at banishing these impossibilities and paradoxes altogether. Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.